co-director of the Marion Wade Center, along with my husband, David Downing. And I am, yes, the inconspicuous David Downing. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you to silence your cell phones, just to make sure we don't have interruptions, because it's going to be a wonderful evening we are going to share together. I am both delighted and honored to introduce you to Dr. Mark Pike. Delighted because this afternoon, my husband and I were able to have a lovely conversation with him and his equally impressive daughter, who is sitting in the back, who came out with him from England. And the honor comes from the fact that this is a very impressive scholar, and he has presented at Harvard University. So you are able to soak up important paradigms that have become known around the world. Dr. Pike teaches as a professor of education at the University of Leeds, where he was one time dean of the School of Education. He is also CEO of a charter school system in England called the Emmanuel Schools Foundation, which serves almost 6,000 students. And as you probably know, because you're here tonight, he is director of the Narnian Virtues Character Education Research Project, which, as we can see in this screen, is funded by the Templeton Foundation. Finally, he is an author of multiple books, one of which is called Ethical English. Another is titled Mere Education, C.S. Lewis as Educator for Our Times. And that is what he is going to be sharing with us tonight, Narnian Virtues, and how they can become, is that a sign I have to stop? They can become part of our educational system. So let us warmly welcome Dr. Pike.
Well, thank you very much. You're extremely kind. And now you've heard something about me, I'd like to hear something about you, so I know something about my audience. Who is a homeschooler here? Okay. Who is a teacher here? Okay. Who's not here because of schooling? Okay. So these guys are a church. Who was it over here? Personal research.
I'm an educational evaluator. I evaluate educational interventions, among other things.
So I'm going to get evaluated tonight. I hope I pass. Yes. Okay, right. Well, thank you so much. So Narnian Virtues. Narnia Virtues Character Education. The illustrations, as you may know, if you are a Lewis geek, which is how my children refer to me, are the original Pauline Baynes illustrations. This is Edmund looking towards the White Witch's castle in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, craving Turkish delight, enchanted Turkish delight. No doubt. So just a little background. My co-investigator in the Narnian Virtues Character Education English Literature Curriculum is Thomas Lacona, who is widely regarded as the father of character education in the US and also globally. He's a developmental psychologist. And I met Tom in 2007 in Washington, D.C. at a conference. And I said, Tom, you've done lots of work on character education. Clearly you can do character education through sport. You can do it through a pastoral system in a school. By commission or omission, I would suggest, you do character education. You cannot not inform or have an influence upon the character of those you are teaching. So I said, well, why don't we put your work together with some of the work that I've done in literature, so moral and character education through literature, and see if we can do some character education through the Narnia stories. And that's how the project started. But I think I'll just turn to something from mere education to start with that you may find of interest. So I was an external examiner at universities in England. You serve for 3 or 4 years as an external examiner at another university. I'm based at the University of Leeds, and I had the privilege to be external examiner at Durham University, which is where Lewis delivered the lectures to teachers that became the abolition of man. So it was a conference for teachers. And actually, the King's Hall, where he gave those lectures, is part of Newcastle University now because of some sort of changes in, you know, which university owns which building. And one lunchtime, I walked out of my building where I was just there for you do sort of 3 days every year, and you go through the students' work and you validate it, some evaluation. And so I walked down along the pavement into the King's College, and I stood there where Lewis had given the lectures that became the abolition of man. And I think that's a good place to start with Lewis, and to start with the abolition of man, and to start with character, why it matters, why it's important, according to Lewis, before we look at the Narnian Virtues project and perhaps the practicalities of how that can work in churches, in schools, with young offenders, in military establishment, with 9-year-olds, with 13-year-olds. But before we get on to that, I think we'll just zoom in and focus on Lewis and character. And he gives a very vivid description in The Abolition of Man of the importance of character. He doesn't talk about a cartoon character. But if it was a cartoon character, it would be the opposite of the bodybuilder. So you know the cartoon character of the bodybuilder with this huge chest and a really tiny head. Well, the picture that Lewis portrays at the start of The Abolition of Man is of a person, a graduate of the schooling system in England at the time, with an enormous head and a shrunken chest. The chest being the site of character, which he describes as being atrophied through lack of exercise. So it's a shrunken chest and a very large head. And he says it's not that we've educated the head too much. He was, after all, a Don at Oxford and then at Cambridge. He says it's not that we've educated the head too much, it's that we have educated the chest too little. So the first part of The Abolition of Man is entitled Men Without Chests. Men without chests. Because the heads, the intellect of the students look bigger than their chests, their character. And I suppose what gave rise to mere education was this acknowledgement, this understanding that much current schooling results in the atrophy of the chest. where character is underdeveloped through a lack of exercise. So that's Lewis. And serious questions are being asked about the chest, our moral sense, and whether schooling is educating the chest well. After all, each of us is more than a head, more than an intellect, more than an animal with appetite, a stomach. There is our chest, the site of just sentiments that make us fully human. Anything less will lead to the abolition of man, the termination of our humanity. And I was struck that this was a scholar known as a Christian apologist, known as a great writer of children's literature, who was also an educator and was fundamentally interested in the products of our education system. So I'll just introduce you to the family, actually. So this is Jeremy. Jeremy Pike is now 13, Lydia's younger brother. This is Luke. Luke is now 18, and he's currently working with 14-year-olds up in Maine on a summer camp before he goes up to Cambridge University when he gets back in the autumn. And then Lydia here with a different haircut is my 16-year-old daughter at the back. And my wife, Babs, of 26 years, declined to grace the front cover. The point of putting children on the front is when you talk about education and Lewis, or a book on education and Lewis, people think very often that it's going to be about Lewis's education, how he hated Malvern College, or about the Oxford tutorial system. But I was with Michael Ward, who I know is coming here. I was with Michael Ward. I was having dinner in the hotel where Michael was very kindly taking me out to, you know, the place where Lewis met Joy Davidman. And I was saying to him that if you look across around 30 works of Lewis's fiction, his theology, his ethics, you can actually discern a clear, distinctively Christian philosophy of education. And so Lewis is known as an apologist. He's known as a literary critic. He's known as a literary author, but he's much less recognized as someone who has something to say to education. And the idea of putting children, 21st century children, on the front cover was really to communicate the message that this is not about Lewis's education, but it's about how Lewis's thinking is relevant to the education and schooling of young people today. What does Lewis have to say about assessment, about discipline, about sex and relationships education, about what a liberal education is, and also about the character of the learner, the character of the learner. Lewis says the same indispensable platitudes will meet us in culture after culture. For instance, selfishness tends not to be admired wherever you are in the world. Even when a child says, "It's not fair," he or she is applying an innate sense of justice. And Lewis asks us to imagine a completely different sort of morality where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. The fact that we do not approve of such behaviour is taken as evidence that we have a shared and innate sense of right and wrong. God's laws written on our hearts, if you like. So I hesitate now that England has been knocked out of the World Cup to use this example, but to give an example from what I would call football and you would call soccer, Lewis argues that there would be no sense in saying that a footballer had committed a foul unless there was some agreement about the rules of football. In the game of life, we instinctively recognize a foul when we see one. Memorably, Lewis declares the human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary colour, or indeed of creating a new sun, a new sky for it to move in. So Lewis has recourse to natural law, or moral law we might say, as the basis for character and moral education. It is this concept, whether Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian or Oriental, that Lewis refers to as the Tao, spelled T-A-O. I had to go all the way to Nanjing in China and wait until after I had given a presentation pronouncing this, the Tao, for a very nice, very polite Chinese gentleman to come up to me at the end and to disabuse me of this notion that it was the Tao, and to say it's the Tao, it's the Tao, Mark. And Lewis uses the term the Tao because it's the Chinese term for the greatest thing or reality. Lewis says it is nature, it is the way, the road, and choosing a traditional Chinese term signals that moral law is not exclusively Christian but universal to humanity. God's laws written on our hearts, which is not to be confused with the truth claims or the beliefs of different religions. The lessons we learn from the Narnia novels are part of the great moral tradition of mankind that Lewis calls the Tao. He says that everyone knows it by nature, it is innate and universal, and it can provide the foundations for moral education in all schools. It's like the law of gravity in the physical sciences, but with one important difference. We have a choice as to whether we obey it or not. In Mere Christianity, Lewis says, we have never followed the advice of the great teachers. There has been no lack of good advice for the last 4,000 years. But let us just think for a moment about how different the Tao is to modern conceptions of right and wrong. So the Tao is a law in the sense that certain actions merit our approval or disapproval. They deserve, they warrant our approval or disapproval. He says we learn the rule of decent behaviour from parents and teachers and friends and books. The law of human nature or natural law has real truth. It has objective reality. Lewis compares natural law to New York City, even though he never visited America. He compares it to New York City, existing quite independently of what people happen to believe about it. Whether you love the Big Apple or whether you hate it, whether you're attracted to it or repelled by it, it is still there. It is still there. And for Lewis, the whole educational project is fundamentally altered by one's beliefs about the Tao or the existence of an objective moral law that compels our allegiance, that warrants following. This is what he says. Hence, the educational problem is wholly different according as you stand within or without the Tao. For those within, the task is to train in the pupil those responses which are in themselves appropriate, whether anyone is making them or not, and in making which the very nature of man consists. For those within the Tao, the task is to train the pupil in those responses which are themselves appropriate, that are right. And for Lewis, schooling often fails to do that. Everything is relative. The point that he makes in the Abolition of Man is that truth is not subjective, that it is not just what you or I happen to think. And he talks about trained habit, these sentiments that by trained habits become stable. He says that character is formed in large part through habitual behaviour that eventually becomes internalized into virtues. Okay, so that's the introduction, and I will try and move relatively rapidly and open up for a question and answer session so that we can have some dialogue. But I think that on the basis of this, I think it would be important to outline something about the Narnian Virtues project, and then maybe a further elaboration is required to answer any questions. Does that sound like a reasonable way to proceed? Okay, so here goes. So there are the 12 Narnian virtues: wisdom, love, fortitude, justice, self-control, forgiveness, humility, integrity, curiosity, hard work, courage, and gratitude. And if anybody has one of the Excellence and Ethics magazines here, there were only 3 left. Does anybody have one of those? Thank you very much. So you may want to just check this out afterwards, but that is then divided into the definitions of the 12 Narnian virtues are here. Thank you very much, sir. And what the Narnian Virtues project does, 2 hours a week over 12 weeks, or 4 hours a week over 6 weeks, is to inculcate these virtues in young people by looking at the Narnia novels, and through their engagement with the Narnia novels and then their application of the virtues that they see in a character or they see missing from a character, the application of that to their own lives. Engage with the virtue development of fictional characters, apply to one's own life, practice and form good habits. So just as an example, here we have Mr. Tumnus, the original Pauline Baynes. As you will know, he attempts to kidnap Lucy in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And then Lucy says, you can't do that. And he's quite contrite. Here he is being contrite. And he then ushers her back to the wardrobe and helps her to escape from Narnia, even though he knows that his beautiful horns may be sawed off and he may be turned to stone by the White Witch if there are any informers who tell on him that he has aided and abetted the escape of a daughter of Eve. So we would then ask the question, when have you ever done that? When have you ever lacked integrity? Because of course he strings Lucy along, doesn't he? He deceives her. So he deceives her. He lulls her into a false sense of security. He takes her back to his nice cozy home. He says, sit down. And really it's a kidnapping exercise. So the question is, well, when have you ever done something like that? When have you ever, we define integrity as not being honest with your, or integrity is being honest with yourself and being honest with other people. So he's lacking in integrity in this instance. So we say, well, when have you ever lacked integrity? When have you been less than honest with other people? I'll give you another couple of examples from the Narnia novels in just a moment. Christian foundations, the law written in their hearts, I've already referred to. 2 Peter, add to your faith virtue. Galatians 5, fruit of the Spirit. The Anglican Church, the Church of England in England has just released, or a year ago, just released a report on character education in its schools. The title is Fruits of the Spirit. Fruits of the Spirit. So why through literature? Why do character education through literature? Lewis says that every act of justice or charity involves putting ourselves in the other person's place. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. In the secondary world of the imagination, significant moral and character educations occurs. We see the motivation for and the consequences of action. This I think is important because, of course, for Lewis, we cannot judge an action to demonstrate a virtue just by looking at the behaviour. We have to know the motivation for the behaviour. It has to be the right thing done for the right reason for it to be a virtue. Quick example, if I'm a Boy Scout and I'm helping a little old lady across the road, if I'm doing it because I want a badge, it's not virtuous. I'm doing it because I want, if I'm doing it because I want people to think that I look good, it's not virtuous. It's better than not helping the little old lady across the road. I'm sure she appreciates it, but morally it's not as good. So why through Narnia? Well, you know, it works for young people. I actually think it works for a far wider range of people than, you know, the 9 to 13 age range. Oh, and an invitation. So we pitched to the funder, the John Templeton Foundation, that we would work with 500 young people in England in what you would call Rust Belt, that's former industrial areas, isn't it? So, you know, former mining and so on, heavy industry, where there, you know, schools where there was a high proportion of children having free school meals, high rates of teenage pregnancy, low rates of progression to further and higher education, low parental involvement, you know, all of the indicators for social priority areas. And we said that we would work with 500 children in those schools, but we also said, and obviously we go into those schools and we interview the teachers and we do focus groups and we interview the children and we look at the lessons. But we said we would also do this with 5,000 children or young people, or young offenders, or military personnel, or people in churches, so much broader, internationally. So we've, you know, got people from Cambodia actually to Colorado, and the invitation is we're not Amazon, so it doesn't arrive in boxes. We do send out we send out PDFs. So Tom Lacona and I have written a teacher handbook that essentially gives the lesson plans and the answers for 12, 2 hours a week for 12 weeks or 4 hours for 6 weeks. A student workbook that the students can follow for 3 books, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And that's really all there is to do it. We do ask that the students go online it takes about an hour to do a pre-test to assess their knowledge and understanding of virtues, their commitment, their levels of empathy. There's a quick sort of psychometric test. And then we post-test so that we can see what impact these 12 sessions on The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe has on the young people. And because it's a fully funded research project, there's no cost. Well, the cost to you would be, the photocopying of the materials, because, as I say, we're not Amazon and we just send out the PDF. So if you're interested in that, whether you're a homeschooler or in a Christian school context or a homeschool context or public state schools, we do lead on the virtues. And so this is designed to work, and it is working in public schools, in state schools, not just in the UK, but in the US, because we lead on the virtues. There is something at the back of the teacher handbook that says, for teachers in Christian schools, you might want to do this, this and this in addition. Okay, so any questions? And then I'll just give you a couple of examples of the activities. So we'll have sort of just 2 or 3 questions, then I'll show you a couple of activities, and then we'll open it up for a really good discussion.
We're going to use the mic for questions since this is being recorded.
Thank you. I would just be curious. I wasn't quite clear.
Could you say who you are?
I'm Jerry.
Hello, Jerry.
Nice to meet you.
Nice
Mark.
to meet you, Jerry.
Blessings on you. You mentioned if there is a merit badge or a reward, it's not virtue. How is that distinguished from something Kant said virtue is its own reward versus something more Aristotelian, virtue leads to the happy life? Is there a distinction you make between those two?
Well, it's not really my distinction. I mean, Lewis is quite Aristotelian in this regard. So, you know, Lewis gives that example of the tennis player, and he talks about the muscles being trained of the tennis player, and he says that if you hit the ball in anger, you might win the match, but that might not be an instance of virtue.
My curiosity, though, was then in some ways, if there is a reward, the happy life, then it's closer to the merit badge than no merit badge, right? You get a reward at the end. There is something.
Yeah, I would say that we're built that way, aren't we? That when we do the right things, we are happier generally. That you know, that good habits, that virtue formation tends to human flourishing. So I think there is a reward, but I think that Lewis's point is that you. So in evaluating character education, some educators tip over into behaviorism and the behaviorist, and they just look at behaviors. They say, you know, is this child, or is this person doing this, and this? And I suppose for Lewis, it's very much deeper than that, because it's, well, do you have the right motivation for doing the right things? Are you not just doing the right things?
I'm Adrian. Actually, I'm from Romania.
Hello,
I have
Adrian.
a question. How would C.S. Lewis view this whole idea of building self-esteem in children with character education?
Building self-esteem. Okay, well, as you probably know, Marge Lamp Mead edited a book, Letters to Children, the letters that Lewis wrote to children who wrote to him. He seemed to not be primarily concerned, perhaps, with self-esteem. He strikes me as being very direct, and you know, when a child wrote a poem or a story and sent it to him, you know, some of the responses are, you know, this image, this metaphor here, really this just won't do. you know, really this just won't do. And there's a chapter on assessment. There's a chapter on assessment here, and this is quite funny. If I can find it, because he refers to educational assessment in Florida, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. If I can find it. So Joan in 1958. He congratulates her on her mark. The original letter from Joan has been lost. And she must have explained how her mark, her score at school had been awarded. And you can almost hear Lewis chuckle as he replies. He says, "What a droll idea in Florida, to give credits not for what you know, but for hours spent in the classroom. Rather like judging the condition of an animal, not by its weight or shape, but by the amount of food that had been offered it." So he's very honest and very direct, not deliberately cruel, I think, but seems to privilege honesty, rather than just engaging in this inflated praise culture that we have today. So, one of the reasons for mere education was to help educators, to help teachers who are suffering an assault of sort of ideological assumptions and psychobabble, and everything must be praised. Because otherwise, in Lewis's words, otherwise the child will have a trauma. To really, to help people get some distance on 21st century education and think about, the way it really should be done.
I'm asking this because actually we are swimming in the ocean of building up self-esteem in children. And that's why I would wonder if he would be today, what he would try to do or say or write about this.
Yeah.
Because actually this is just a tsunami of,
Yeah.
and coming over in Eastern Europe as well as
Really?
the Western Europe, yes.
That's interesting, because my perception was that some of those places, my wife is from Germany. We met because the University of Leeds, where I was an undergraduate, and Tübingen University, where she was, had an exchange, and my perception was that the German education system was, and the Eastern European systems were sort of more like maybe Britain in the 50s, not having succumbed to this inflated praise culture, but it's shifting. Yeah. Okay, wow. Last question, and then I'll just give you a couple of examples, and then we'll carry on the conversation.
Sure. Thanks for coming out for this. Reading the description for this evening's talk, speaking of the Narnian Virtues, I guess I came in with a couple assumptions, one being that with Lewis's classical upbringing, I was expecting maybe a list of 7 virtues, the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 Christian virtues. And so when you listed 12 instead of 7, I was wanting to know what the rationale was behind, for example, listing curiosity as a virtue. I like it. I'm a fan. I'm just trying to figure out how to mentally, how do we categorize and describe curiosity in terms of virtue?
Okay, so thank you for that question. It is different. The 12 virtues, which could have been 10 or could have been 6, are different to the 8 laws of the Tao in the appendix to the Abolition of Man. What we really have is 6 virtues with some sub-virtues. So we would see right curiosity, as in having an inquiring mind, a thirst for knowledge, being part of wisdom, that it is wise to want to learn. We would see forgiveness as part of love, that you really can't have one without the other. And how did we come to 12? Tom had 10 essential virtues. I suppose that rather than saying that Lewis has these 12 Narnian virtues, it was really driven by teachable moments in the novels. So we worked with teachers, and we could see Lucy's fortitude or Edmund's lack of self-control, and the virtues were really derived from what we saw in the novels. So we asked Michael Ward, the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, and we asked Joel Heck to scope the novels for virtues for us. That was the first stage. So they scoped the novels for virtues. And then we went to teachers, to practitioners in the classroom, because these guys were Lewis scholars, literary theorists, and we said, okay, so what's teachable? And then I worked with the teachers to, will that fly as a lesson? Will that work as a lesson? I'll give you a couple of examples of how that process worked, which might help. Okay, so do not be alarmed. I'm not going to talk to every slide in this 36 slide presentation. So here we have wisdom. Without wisdom, we cannot make good choices. Curiosity is the mark of an active mind. Wisdom includes curiosity. Love includes forgiveness. And love includes gratitude. Integrity, the habit of being true to ourselves and truthful with others. We know that human beings have an extraordinary propensity for self-deception. Integrity includes humility, an accurate appraisal of ourselves. So this is really marrying up some of Tom's work in developmental psychology and some of the Lewis work and what's going on in the classrooms. Fortitude, inner toughness. And the first example in just a moment will be of fortitude. And we can send you all of this. You know, we can send you samples, or we can send you the whole thing for free if you want to think about whether to do this or have a shot at it in your context to see if it works. I mean, it's a research project, right? So, you know, it might work, it might not work in your context, but we'd like to know. And the other agenda, of course, was to get Lewis, you know, to get Narnia read. Self-control, self-restraint, and justice. Okay? And the model, the pedagogic model, is really simple. Understand the virtues, so you acquire a virtues vocabulary, identify the virtues exhibited by a character, empathize with the character, value the virtues, and then apply the virtues in your own life. And we define virtues as good moral habits, not just good habits like brushing your teeth, but good moral habits like fortitude. And there's lots of talk, isn't there, in education about people fulfilling their potential. But we know that young people will not fulfill their potential if they don't have certain virtues established in their lives that support their learning, unless they are humble enough to be teachable, unless they're resilient enough to bounce back from mistakes, unless they have the fortitude to keep going, unless they have a good work ethic. Okay. Okay. Oh, this may be relevant, Jerry. This is Lewis. So Lewis says, right actions done for the wrong reasons do not help build the internal quality of character called a virtue. And it is this quality of character that really matters. Right, you get to be the guinea pigs. Now then, each of the participants is armed with a highlighter pen. Do I have any highlighter pens? But these are not just any highlighter pens. These are highlighter pens that my daughter Lydia discovered. And they are remarkable highlighter pens because they have an eraser at the end that can rub out the highlighting. So Lydia gets a mention. And we nearly bankrupted the stock of these in the UK. The supplier of the pens must have thought, what is going on? We have this run on green highlighter pens. And the idea is that you take the green highlighter pen and you mark the virtues, and you take the red highlighter pen and you mark the vices. This is stage one. It actually began, we were trying to get away from the red and green thing. And it started with being green for virtues and orange for vices. And then I did this teacher training because we've got some schools in the Netherlands that do this. And I was saying you use orange to mark the vices. And there was this collective intake, this hiss, this sort of intake of breath across the whole audience. And I thought, what cultural blunder have I made this time? And they said, you can't use our national colour for vice. So we're now using green and red, and we're obviously offending another nationality who will not be doing Narnian Virtues. You know, right, so what would you mark? What would you mark, and how would you identify the virtue? Because although it says integrity at the top, this is the teacher guide. So that, you know, we don't do the, okay class, today you're doing integrity. The idea is they have to figure out from the passage what the virtue is. For the next few days she was very miserable. She could have made it up with the others quite easily at any moment if she could have brought herself to say that the whole thing was only a story made up for fun, that Narnia did not really exist. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she really was in the right, and she could not bring herself to say this. The others, who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to do it, but Edmund could be spiteful. And on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy and kept on asking her if she'd found any other new countries in other cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine, very rare occurrence, and they were out of doors from morning to night, bathing, fishing, climbing trees and lying in the heather. But Lucy could not properly enjoy any of it, and so things went on until the next wet day. She's showing integrity. She is a very truthful girl. She's also showing fortitude. And then the idea is, well, where have you in your peer group had to show integrity? Where have you had to stand up for what you believe to be right and not cave into peer pressure? Where have you had to have the courage of your convictions? She's the youngest sibling. Older children with more power are saying, oh, come on. She could have made it all go away in an instant. All the taunting, all of the teasing. She could have had a nice, peaceful life. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she was really in the right, and she could not bring herself to say this. She couldn't contravene, go against herself. Being truthful was part of who Lucy is. And so we challenge the young people, people in churches, other contexts. Where do you have to do that? How does that apply to you? What can you learn from this character? I'll do just one more. Edmund and the Turkish delight, a lack of self-control. Enchanted Turkish delight. This is serious stuff. Anyone who had once tasted it would want more and more of it, and would, even if they were allowed, go on eating it till they killed themselves. And this is manipulation. If you bring your siblings to me, I will give you more Turkish delight. So we ask our young people, what is your Turkish delight? What do you need to exercise more self-control over? What is your Turkish delight? His life is revolving around how to get the Turkish delight. His life is revolving around his next fix. What are you overly dependent upon? What are you not exercising self-control over because it is controlling you? And just a couple of examples. They do this at home, they do this in families, and they write on a card, you know, what the Turkish delight of different family members is. And my youngest son, Jeremy, who you saw on the front cover with some of his friends, he was 11 when he was part of the early, one of the early years of this. And at the start of the school year, he'd asked me and Babs and his siblings, you know, what our Turkish delight was. About 6 weeks later, there's a kind of a catch-up and accountability session. I'm at breakfast. Jeremy is tucking into a bacon butty, a bacon roll, bacon sandwich. He turns to me, out of the blue, without any warning. You know how cruel children can be. Dad, how are you getting on with your Turkish delight? I had written this exercise, and I had completely forgotten that I had written this exercise, which really did seem like a good idea at the time when it was going to be inflicted upon other parents, but not me. Dad, hang on, I'll go and get the box, the little watch box that you put these little cards in. Goes to the box, gets my card out. Dad, it says here, you're going to exercise more self-control. You are going to take exercise every day. Half an hour's exercise every day. It says here, you are going to lose weight. I'm thinking, I've been really busy. I've been doing the Narnian Virtues project. I've put on weight. One girl with a single mum said, my Turkish delight is my mobile phone. She was 12 years old. My smartphone. She said, my smartphone is running my life. It goes to bed with me. My friends expect me to be accessible of all times of the day and night. I'm not getting enough sleep. I'm becoming grumpy. She went to her mother as part of the home activities for this. I need to get this under control. Now, this may sound like blisteringly common sense to you and me, but they decide this was nothing less than a revelation to them that was really helpful. I'm going to limit my mobile phone use. The interesting thing was, or the significant thing was, the child was in the driving seat. I'm going to decide to leave my phone with my mum. It's not going to come to my bedroom with me. I'm going to tell my friends that I'm not going to be available all hours of the day and night. I'm not going to be socially available all hours of the day and night. She was happier. She was getting more sleep. She was less grumpy. She was exercising some control over her smartphone usage rather than it being something that was controlling her and that she was being dictated to. So that's the kind of result that we want. So there's an ulterior motive. We want young people reading high quality fiction. We want Lewis and Narnia back in schools, in all sorts of schools, but most of them are state public schools just because of the number of those that there are compared to, you know, independent Christian schools. And not only do we want them reading the Lewis, reading the Narnia, we want them having those sorts of experiences. And the other thing, and I'll just end on this, in a Christian school, a very committed head teacher said to me, I'm a little bit doubtful about all of this emphasis on character, Mark, because by grace you're saved through faith. And I don't want the children here, you know, thinking that if they practice all these virtues, that it's some sort of salvation through self-help kind of program. And this bothered me. And so I went away. This was just before the summer. And I went away and I thought, well, let's see what Lewis has to say. And I found this old bookshop with the 3 volumes that were made into Mere Christianity. Broadcast talks, little sort of paperback things that, you know, sort of fall apart, you know, produced during the war years. No, not during the war years. And there's one that's called Christian Behaviour, and I was reading, and there's that wonderful quote by Lewis. I'm not going to get it quite right, but essentially he says, try practicing the Christian virtues for 6 weeks, and you will find out some truths about yourself. Try practicing the Christian virtues for 6 weeks, and you will find out some truths about yourself. I don't know about you, I don't need 6 weeks. In fact, I don't need 6 days. And so being very clear about these virtues that we see illustrated by Lewis in the Narnia novels teaches us something very important about ourselves. Thank you very much. Can I suggest that you turn to a partner and have 1 minute, 60 seconds, comments and questions? I believe this may be called, on this side of the Atlantic, I had never heard this until last week, and I heard it referred to as a buzz break. Have you heard the term a buzz break? Okay, so would you be so kind, ladies and gentlemen, to, in pairs or threes, formulate some questions or comments? Thank you. Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, any questions? Answers are so much nicer. Any questions or comments and invitation to participate? If you email narnianvirtues@leeds.ac.uk, we will send you materials in exchange for a your children or participants or church members or whoever doing a pre-test. Hello.
Hello. Is this on? Yes. I'm curious to know if there's a Bible component to this, and if so, how it's received in the UK, because I think it would be really wonderful to have connections to the Bible from the stories and Bible verses to memorize to go with the virtues. But I'm sure that would be hard to introduce in the public schools in the UK.
So although it's a much more secular society, 1/3 of the school-age population in the UK attend church schools. Most of them Church of England. So if you get a Christian head and a Christian chair of governors, there is a mandate. If you can carry it with your largely secular parent body. There is a lot of biblical Christian worldview at the end of the teacher handbook for Christian parents and teachers in Christian schools. It is faith learning integration. It's not so much, so it is scriptural, but we've not gone down the route of attaching scriptures to virtues. We've tried to do something a little more holistic in terms of, so when we get to love, which is number 10 of the 12 passages, so there are 12 extracts. It's entitled Aslan instead of Edmund, and we teach love as self-sacrifice and doing things for other people. But apart from that passage, the notes for teachers try to do something quite comprehensive in terms of Christian worldview and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and marrying the two up. But we seek to go beyond attaching scriptures to virtues, which we think the teachers will do anyway. You look slightly puzzled.
When you say holistic, I see scriptures being a part of being truly holistic. But
Yeah, no, I do as well. But what I mean is,
Do you want to repeat her comment that she sees Scripture being part of holistic.
Yeah, no, we do too. But what we try to do is to use or to draw upon the Scripture to make it personally applicable to the child and relevant. But take a look at the materials. And, you know, we're learning as we go along. Please give us feedback about how useful that material is on the Christian message in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, in Narnian Virtues, that's at the end of the teacher handbook. You know, give us some feedback. We don't lead on that because we think it just wouldn't get taken up in, you know, in secular state public schools if we did. But we say, you know, if you are in a Christian context, you know, here is a wealth of very, very rich scriptural Christian worldview material that can accompany this. Yeah.
This is more of a comment. It goes along with what the previous person just mentioned, but also to your question, why literature? And I think about how Jesus, when he wanted to make points, he always told stories.
Yeah.
Always. And I also, the other one from Scripture that really was powerful to me was when Nathan was talking to David about his sin. He told a whole story, and it was more pointed than if he had said to him, say out of a scripture passage, like the Ten Commandments, you have committed adultery, and you know. But the story that he told said it so much, it was so much more impactful.
Yeah, and Lewis refers to it as getting past watchful dragons, doesn't he? You know, that perhaps people who haven't responded to the Christian message, you know, may respond to the Christian message, you know, through Aslan, the great lion, giving himself for, you know, for Edmund, the traitor. Yeah. No.
What's the age for this program?
So we're doing it with 9 to 13-year-olds in the UK, but the distance version of it is completely open. You know, if you want to do it with 50-year-olds as part of a church group, I was in Virginia yesterday. There was somebody at West Point, you know, wanting to do it with, you know, military personnel. There was another chap in the session who was working with young offenders, who was wanting to work on the cultivation of virtue with, you know, with young offenders. I know that there's a wealth of Lewis scholarship out there that's focused on Lewis and focused on his works. And I'm not sort of going down the, you know, the reader response theory route. You know, it can mean anything you want it to mean. But I do think that how readers read and engage with and respond to Lewis is underexplored. And because the Narnia novels are for children, but written in the 1950s, I think it's important that we as an academic community committed to Lewis know more about how those novels are being read by 21st century readers.
I was wondering if you've had any experience in discerning virtues. In the virtue and its vice is probably easier to identify, but it seems like much of the conflict we have in life is with conflicting virtues. And in Christianity, we often say we have a conflict between truth and love, you know, whether to express a truth or show love. And both are virtues. And in our society today, it's, you know, it's very easy to want to speak truth to a subject, and then you think, well, maybe I should just say nothing. It's better than to, increase the animosity or whatever it is going on. And I find that it seems like so much conflict is a conflict of virtues. I wonder if you've had any experience with that, resolving that question.
Yeah, on an almost daily basis, because my wife is German, and I really get the truth. I'll write something and she'll read it, and I will know just how bad it is. In all seriousness, there was a study of Americans and Germans who were put together. A colleague at Calvin College, David Smith, had Germans and Americans emailing each other as sort of pen pals, and it reinforced some cultural stereotypes. The Germans were very harsh and said, well, this is wrong, and you need to correct this, and you need to do this, and followed it with a sort of a positive. And the Americans were positive, 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 but you might think about doing this to improve it. And the Americans just thought that the Germans were just plain rude and harsh, and the Germans thought the Americans were not really being honest. Somebody gives me a red tie, and I don't like a red tie for Christmas. And I don't like red ties, and what do I say? Do I say, oh, I don't have one of these in my collection? Well, why would I? Can't stand red ties. We haven't done, I suppose because we're working with 9 to 14-year-olds, it seems to have been simpler than that. That doesn't seem to be something that's been coming out of the classrooms quite so much. But we've had so many examples. Boys, I'm just sort of running through the interviews and the focus groups. Boys routinely lying. That if you're in trouble, you just lie. To get out of it, to get out of trouble. That this is normal, and them being much more honest than adults, and much more wearing their heart on their sleeve. I mean, okay, it's anonymous, and they're talking to a researcher, but saying, well, I was doing this all the time. Now I actually think that, having looked at Edmund, there's something wrong here with what I'm doing, but I was a routine serial liar. This was just the way I got through life and tried to stay out of trouble. Denying, no, it wasn't me, Gov. Really quite disturbing in some ways, but pleasing in others. So we seem to have had lots of truth on the part of the young people, and what I'm curious about through this invitation and the distance trial is, would we get similar levels of honesty with adults? Because is it a cultural thing? Is it the fact that they're mostly in Yorkshire or the north of England? There's a saying that, so they're very sort of down to earth, working class. There's a phrase, call a spade a spade. In Yorkshire, you call a spade a spade. You say it the way it is. Is that the reason, or is the reason that they're young people, and do we become, less candid as we get older? Would adults have that? Would men say, yes, I've been lying to my wife? I don't know. You're the evaluator.
I like qualitative data.
This is scary.
I like qualitative data. So I like the fact that you're doing focus groups and interviews. I'm supposed to be cutting interviews this week, but I haven't been. I've been reading Lewis and Tolkien. But I'm curious, do you have any quantitative data that you've been looking at as well? Here in the States, we usually look at in-school suspensions, that kind of stuff for behavioral interventions. I don't know what you have there, but what kind of data do you have?
Yeah, so we pre and post test. We pre-test according to, we pre-test knowledge, and then there's a psychometric test of dispositions. So we have 500 young people with a 500 cohort control group with schools matched for socioeconomics. So a school with 45% pupil premium children, free school meals, of a certain ethnic mix would be matched with a control group, 45% free school meals, same ethnic mix that didn't have Narnian Virtues. And at the moment what we're finding is we've got statistically significant positive results on two things over just 12 weeks, 2 hours per week, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. One of them is empathy. And there's a, where's that Lewis quote at the start? In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Every act of justice or charity involves putting ourselves in the other person's place. So we've got empathy, and the other sort of green light flashing on the dashboard. Do you have dashboards?
Yes.
That's on a car. Okay.
Yeah, that's what
Okay.
You say green and red, I'm like data visualization.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the other one is caring about or commitment to virtues. So the knowledge is a really steep, line on the graph. From children do not know what integrity is or what fortitude is. And I actually think that in not all children, these are not, middle class Christian home kids. They don't actually understand many of the definitions of the virtues. I looked over at you and I was going to say something about churches, and I have completely forgotten. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So sometimes I think in church we say, come to Christ, and somebody makes a commitment, but we're not always specific enough about what that means in terms of integrity, fortitude, work ethic, in terms of the process, whether you call it discipleship or sanctification or growing in Christ, or in terms of the change that happens in a person. Sometimes I think we don't put legs on it. We're not sort of specific enough, and we say things like, get close to God, which is really good advice. But being more specific about, we'll actually, maybe you're going to need some fortitude here to work on this relationship, or whatever it is.
Okay, one last question.
I wanted to support you and then challenge you a bit. In terms of what you're just talking about, they did a study of 5-year-olds in America and said, what do you do when you get to a street corner? And the children said, you look both ways. And they said, what are you looking for? And children said, we don't know. It was a classic idea of a virtue without, they just thought it was some sort of ritual that would give you safety across the street. In terms of the challenge, Lewis wrote in Experiment Criticism that we should receive literature rather than try to use it.
Yes.
And when he talks about getting past the watchful dragons of religious virtue and church education, he's talking about a self-consciousness as opposed to a subliminal approach. Could it be argued that this approach is using the Narnia Chronicles rather than receiving them? And could it be argued that this approach might awaken watchful dragons? People would look at a text and say, oh, there's integrity, there's fortitude, as opposed to subliminally seeing what happens to people like Edmund and what happens to people like Lucy.
Sure. So I'm not a huge believer in the osmosis principle of learning. I think sometimes it is important to be explicit. I love an experimenting criticism, and the the depiction of the boy reading under the bedclothes at the start, and that really challenged me. Are we using the novels rather than just fostering an aesthetic, even spiritual response? You know, are we making use of the novels? I think we're not contravening the past watchful dragons, because we're not going hard at the you know, the allegorical aspect. You know, the emperor over the sea is God, Aslan is Jesus, atonement, you know, sacrifice, substitutionary sacrifice, Aslan instead of, you know, Edmund. So we're not spoiling it in that regard. What I would say is, and a lot of this depends on the teacher, of course, and the classroom, but at its best, I think that there is a personal response, that the personal response of the reader to the characters that Lewis has created is enhanced. So they actually they engage more with Edmund by, you know, realizing his addiction and his lack of self-control. They engage more with Lucy once they have a virtues vocabulary. So many of these children don't have a sufficient virtues vocabulary to start with. And there are all kinds of questions around, can you think about something if you don't have the language for it? So we provide them with a virtues vocabulary, and then they can start to talk about Lucy in terms of fortitude and integrity, just in terms of their analysis of her character. They can talk about Edmund's lack of integrity or lack of self-control. And I would see that as enhancing this sort of aesthetic response. We've tried really hard to get away from today you're doing integrity, or this week you're doing integrity. And so what we do is we do some work at the start with them on, you know, the range of virtues, so that they have a kind of a palette. We do some work, you know, a painter's palette. So we do some work at the start with them on you know, definitions, what are particular virtues, and so on. So we enhance their virtues literacy. And then we look at a passage and we say, well, what's going on here? And the idea is that you know, integrity is elicited from them as part of the response and part of the class discussion. Hi, Jerry.
Okay.
That was a cough. You did that really well.
One last one.
I think you're okay on the experiment and criticism thing. When Lewis says you have to receive the text first, he means you need to let it wash over you. You need to make sure you've got your message right. Yeah. He's not saying you can't think critically about it. To think critically about it is not necessarily to use it. Lewis's whole literary life was doing literary criticism. Yeah. So that's okay. And the other thing, too, is I think that this getting past watchful dragons, he's talking about that in the context of akrasia or akrasia. That when
Pardon?
It's an Aristotelian term, it's a biblical term too. When I do something wrong, to live with myself, I have to rationalize the bad choice. So the Greek means to live without command in my life. So Lewis writes, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Or Paul says, we suppress truth in our unrighteousness. So once that's done, how do you get through to that heart that's got the watchful dragons up? And the way you can do it sometimes is with story, not always, but sometimes with story. So again, it's the idea of receiving, let it wash over you. Then go ahead and think critically about it. It doesn't mean receive and never think critically about it. And the people who receive literature too keep going back to those same texts. So it's also a love of the text. But this is helpful, I think, in the idea of giving them the vocabulary so that they can see, I think is also helpful. I just wanted to give you some support.
Let's give Dr. Pike a hand. And I am sure he would be willing to take one-on-one questions. Feel free to continue and have conversations here in this fertile environment. Thank you for coming tonight.